Chapter 1335. I'm sitting on the chair in a police station, looking at the mouths of two men in black and white checkered uniforms opposite me. It's like they're talking about something. The man on the left has a cold expression on his face, as if he has been through too many unfortunate events. The man on the right is a little inexperienced, and there's a hint of pity in his eyes. I don't feel any pain, nor did I regret delivering that final stab. At that moment, I even felt that I had been liberated. The warm blood that sprayed on my body was like salvation from a god. I only regret my fervent pursuit of money in my youth. I had sacrificed my dignity, my body, and my freedom. Over the past few days at the police station, I've had enough peace and quiet. I had the opportunity to ponder this question at a deeper level, far deeper than whatever that I've been thinking about over the years. Me having a weak will and being immature were the source of the mistakes I made. But they weren't the only reason. Ever since I was a child, all the education I received told me that working and striving hard is for that big house, those full floor-to-ceiling windows that let in plenty of light, to have more than 3 servants, a lawn and garden that I can call my own, silver-plated or even gold-plated cutlery, be able to host a banquet filled with delicacies, run balls that were filled with melodious music, etc. The newspapers and magazines I'd read also told me over and over again that only those that showed a sufficient level of decency can be called middle class. They are the true pillars of support for this kingdom. They are people of high class, excellence, zero mediocrity, and integrity, while having compassion and knowledge. At the same time, they also told me what decency was. It's wearing a beautiful dress, matching expensive skincare products, cosmetics, and exquisite fashion handbags for different occasions. It was to attend concerts, high tea, and gatherings filled with class. And all of this translated means gold pounds, and gold pounds. I have to admit that pursuing a better life is instinctual for everyone. However, when the influences on a girl tells her in every aspect that, when the mainstream views of society are all about appearance, exquisiteness and elegance, it's very difficult to not have her thoughts become influenced. I don't know what this phenomenon is called. I only know that if all of this can't be changed, then a tragedy like mine will continue happening more and more often. When that happens, someone would definitely curse. Look at these gold-digging women, selling out their souls. Subconsciously, I turn around and see the beautiful and bustling world outside. I see the bright red blood flowing in this world. Miss Tracy, are you listening to us? A voice distracts my thoughts, coming from the slightly inexperienced policeman. I grin at him, not telling him I'm thinking about some philosophical questions. What a joke. A gold digger who sold her soul is actually thinking of such inane matters when she's being interrogated by the police. The policeman nods and says to me, "Miss Tracy, you'll be put on trial soon. We'll arrange a lawyer for you." I'm sorry, we didn't manage to retain the witness. Just having his testimony isn't in your favor. It's okay, I say quietly to him. I will try my best to defend myself and repent for the crimes I have committed. I only hope that I can restart life anew. I think for a moment and curl the corners of my lips. I say to the 2 officers, "Can you borrow a few books from the library for me while I wait to go on trial?" Yes, Phenomena of Sociology and Education. At that moment, I see the 2 police officers in a daze, and a hint of surprise. I sit at the far end of the mottled table and hear Miss Judgment describe the Utopia incident. After she finishes, I look around and hoarsely say, "This is a ritual." Unsurprisingly, I see Miss Judgment's gaze freeze. I can sense Mr. Hanged Man and Miss Justice looking over with a hint of speculation in their eyes. At this moment, I can almost guess what they're thinking. They definitely suspect that this is the World Gehrman Sparrow Sequence 1 ritual. And they are already long aware from the talks in the tarot gatherings that the existence of a Sequence 0 true God makes it impossible for a Sequence 1 to exist. Regarding this matter, I have already prepared an explanation. It is to let them think about the ancient sun god and his 8 kings of angels. Unfortunately, no one raises any questions. They may have already made the connection to the kings of angels, or perhaps they believe that the ritual involving Utopia is mainly to help Mr. Fool awaken further. I look at the lady who is lost in thought, and I ask after some deliberation, "Miss Tracy, where do your parents live?" "They've already passed away." The beautiful lady whose soul no longer belongs here replies with an ethereal voice. I lower my head and record it. "Do you have any other relatives?" The lady turns to look out the window and answers casually, "No. I exchange looks with my colleague and raise my voice. Miss Tracy, are you listening to us? The lady opposite me retracts her distant gaze and smiles at me. I don't know what she's thinking about. She's so quiet, like a flower blooming alone in the night. This analogy comes from an anthology of poems. My brother told me that reading poems makes me more charming. Of course, up till now, the poems have only brought mostly mockery. All of the police officers believe that it's worthless. When I tell the lady opposite me about the trial, I see a faint smile on her face as she pleads us to borrow a few books from the library, ones that I believe are difficult just from the title. The smile and the names of the book combine together into an indescribable beauty. After sending Miss Tracy back to the temporary detention room, I pack up the materials for the case and prepare to pay a visit to the lawyer. It's something that had been predetermined long ago. I lean back in my chair and listen to the Moon Emlyn describe his dream. After Father Yutravsky's appraisal, this dream has been confirmed to have not originated from the Earth Mother. This inevitably makes people cast their looks of suspicion at the moon, towards a state prior to being corrupted by the Mother Goddess of Depravity. I'm nearly amused by my own thoughts. As an experienced seer, a master at deciphering dreams, I'm not held back by modesty. I frankly reveal what I know. The three possibilities are that this dreamscape is trying to bait you into exploring and pursuing something. To a certain extent, it can interfere with your fate. Secondly, this dreamscape hopes that you can interpret it deeply and understand it. Then, through this, corrupt you in an indiscernible manner. Thirdly, you are too worried about the matter of becoming a beauty goddess, so you dreamed of that remarkably terrifying scene. The third possibility doesn't need elaborating on. The action needed for the first two possibilities are the same. Don't think about it, don't investigate. There's no need to leave Backlund. With that said, I see Emlyn nod without any hesitation. I know it's his way of handling things. A murder case? I browse the information on the case in my hand, and I use the changes in the tone of my voice to express my doubts. You should hire a senior lawyer. I'm just a solicitor, and strictly speaking, I don't have the right to represent anyone in court. Of course, this is only in the strictest of cases, but in reality, that never happens. As long as the case isn't too serious and doesn't involve the criminal courts, a solicitor can provide assistance to the court. The policeman in a black and white checkered uniform opposite me says with a smile, Utopia is only a small city. We don't have senior lawyers. We'll have to hire them from elsewhere. Besides, this case is a case of self-defense. The sentence period will be very short, and the monetary aspect of this case doesn't even exceed £400. The trial can be done at the magistrate courts. When self-defense is deemed invalid, it'll be handed over to the criminal courts. He knows plenty. Is he planning on switching professions to become a lawyer? However, in normal circumstances, he still has to hand a homicide case that has unjustifiable self-defense to the criminal courts. Heh, this is the benefit of a small city. There are many things that aren't that strict. I think for a moment and reply tersely, I'll try defending the client by claiming innocence. Also, please arrange for me to meet Miss Tracy as soon as possible. After flipping through the information from before, I'm already quite confident in this case. The biggest problem now is whether Miss Tracy's image can lead to the sympathy of others. Yes, although my solicitor license was forged from elsewhere, this cannot deny my professionalism. It just so happened that I made mistakes on that examination. Bansi? Verdu wants to go to Bansi? I sit at the bottom end of the long mottled table and look at the hanged man who has reported to Mr. Fool. I have some doubts about the development of the matter. Verdu, who's engrossed in mysticism and is trying to save Mr. Dorr, does have certain reasons to search Bansi Harbor. Furthermore, he has stayed in Byam for almost half a year, so it's very normal for him to come into contact with information about Bansi. The main problem is that the hanged man's previous surveillance didn't provide any corresponding signs, making Verdu's actions seem a little out of place. The importance placed on this matter has to be raised. I nod inwardly and hear Mr. Fool instruct, "Continue monitoring." I play the 7-string guitar by the fountain in the municipal square. I use my knife and fork to slice the steak. In the cathedral, I describe the teachings of the goddess to the believers. I reach out my right hand and leave the carriage with the help of a gentleman. I get the new dress I had been eyeing for so long, and I can't wait to change into it. I stride forward with my 4 legs as I'm being chased by a child. I laugh loudly as I totter about and play with a dog. Suddenly, we tremble. We look up into the sky and see illusory, thin lines drilling out from our bodies. They extend to an infinite height, extending beyond the grayish-white fog. They extend into an ancient palace and land in the hands of a tall figure shrouded in fog. During this period of time, Klein's state had always been very strange, as though he had completely transformed into thousands of lives. Every clone had their own will, thoughts, knowledge, and fate. However, above this collective consciousness was a primary consciousness that held control. It constantly suffered all kinds of attacks, as though it could be assimilated by the sea of consciousness that had been formed autonomously at any moment. However, it eventually withstood the barrage of attacks, allowing Klein to maintain a certain level of clarity. His true body had been lying underground in St. Ariana Cathedral. His consciousness would occasionally rise and enter Sapphira Castle, and occasionally sink into his body. All the scenes that the marionette clones experienced constantly flashed in his mind like a dream formed from large amounts of fragments. Chapter 1336 Interaction Backlund Steam Locomotive Station, Platform 3. Alfred chatted with his parents and sister for a while before rushing to leave the train during the gap in between. He came to the platform and said to his squire, "Give me an East Balham cigarette." If the past few years had any negative impact on him, other than his mental suffering and pain, he still retained a few bad habits. After smoking plenty of East Balham cigarettes that consisted of spices and herbs wrapped in roasted tobacco leaves, Alfred was no longer used to the paper cigarettes that remained popular in the northern continent. He believed that they were bland and tasteless, as though they were liquor diluted with water. As for cigars, he felt that it needed a good environment to slowly savor it. It didn't suit his present situation. Of course, his smoking addiction wasn't too serious. A disciplinary paladin had a good enough constitution and spirit to resist such influences. Alfred came to the platform to smoke because he felt that it was too stuffy in the train carriage. Besides, his mother often raised the issue of him not being married. After the squire took it out and lit the East Balham cigarette, Alfred brought the stick that was nearly charred black to his mouth and sucked it deeply. The strong smell entered his body, causing his spirit to jolt. At that moment, he saw a blonde-haired man who looked like a classic sculpture walking over with his valet. Alfred hesitated and smiled. He raised his right hand and said, "Hibbert, I thought you wouldn't be returning to East Chester." It was Earl Hall's eldest son, Alfred's brother, Lord Hibbert Hall. Hibbert drew a perfect smile and said, "I'm just a cabinet secretary, not the cabinet chief secretary. I won't be so busy that I don't even have the weekend off." In fact, he had no plans on being a cabinet chief secretary, either. His main goal was to accumulate experience at the various departments in the government and build up his own networks and resources to prepare for entering the House of Lords in the future. Alfred took another puff of the East Balham cigarette and smiled. Happy weekend. After watching Hibbert enter the carriage, Alfred sensed that someone was looking over and was discussing. "Why aren't there any passengers waiting for that train carriage? It doesn't seem to be full." "Haha, that's a special carriage. It was pre-booked by an important figure for a large sum of money. I know that you might not have seen such a situation before, but you have to remember that this happens frequently in big cities like Backlund and Constant. When those important figures bring their entire family out, they will definitely have more than 100 servants follow. Perhaps there might even be pets, so how can they squeeze in a train carriage with ordinary people? Is that so? I wonder who is this big shot?" Alfred turned his head to look. There were dozens of people in gray-blue uniforms on Platform 2, who were quietly surveying Platform 3 across the empty tracks. The distance between the two parties wasn't small. If Alfred's hearing wasn't outstanding, he wouldn't be able to figure out what they were discussing. "They are." Alfred turned to ask his adjutant. He could only recognize that the uniform they were wearing belonged to a railway company. The adjutant turned around immediately and asked the staff at the platform. Soon, he jogged back and whispered to Alfred, "General, they're train dispatchers from all over the kingdom. They're undergoing short-term training in Backlund." Alfred nodded slightly and glanced at the platform 2 again. The oldest of the train dispatchers had white hair and the youngest looked to be in their early 20s. Most of them were middle-aged men in their 30s or 40s with gray sideburns. In the Sonia Sea, City of Generosity, Byam, Verdu carried his luggage, which didn't contain many valuables, and boarded the boat at night. He left the harbor and boarded a pirate ship. As a Sequence 7 of the Apprentice Pathway, he wasn't very good at combat. And even though Verdu had a mystical item with him, he was rather afraid of its negative effects. He wasn't willing to use it unless it was critical to do so. Therefore, in order to avoid danger, he tried his best not to bring anything that would easily attract the greed of pirates which he didn't trust. The pirate on the deck glanced at Verdu and scoffed. "There's no need to be afraid. We always keep our promises. As long as you pay for the journey, we definitely won't throw you into the sea. Here, it'll be even safer than you taking a passenger ship. At least you don't have to worry about encountering pirates." Seeing Verdu silent as though he appeared somewhat afraid, the pirate gleefully threw a key to him. The second floor on deck, the room at the end. Verdu caught the brass key and entered the cabin. He climbed up the stairs and headed down the corridor. This level seemed to be specially prepared for the people who boarded the pirate ship for various reasons. Along the way, Verdu encountered a few passengers that were totally unlike pirates. Among them was a street girl who was dressed rather scantily, a middle-aged man with a protruding belly and oily faces, an extremely cold young man wearing a cloak and a top hat. "Do you want to join me?" the lady smiled and asked when she saw Verdu looking over. She fluttered her eyes at him as she asked. It wasn't clear if she was planning to do some business on the trip, or if she was doing business while happening to make a trip. Verdu ignored her and withdrew his gaze before walking to his room. That well-defined and cold young man also stopped at the entrance diagonally opposite. "Backlund, West Borough, 9 Bellotto Street. Come in." Zio straightened her body from the huge, wide seat. The door creaked open, and two MI9 members who were under Zio walked in. "Colonel, we found some information regarding the investigation of Utopia." A man in a dark-colored jacket handed Zio a report. Zio was startled as she perked up. "What is it?" The man in a dark-colored jacket simply said, "In the past few days, we took advantage of the free time we had from completing our previous mission to visit all the passengers in Backlund from that particular steam locomotive through our informants." Without a doubt, he was referring to the steam locomotive that had stopped at Utopia. "Okay." Zio nodded and gestured for her subordinate to continue. The man in a deep jacket pointed at the report and said, "We have preliminary confirmation that none of the passengers that successfully arrived in Backlund show any abnormalities. They're in good spirits and have no problems with their memories. However, we discovered something. At that time, not everyone returned to the train. According to two passengers, their neighbors chose to remain in Utopia. One was a lady who loves traveling and exploration. She has a deep love for foreign places. After witnessing the outstanding red wine, desserts, and unique fizzling iced tea in Utopia, she decided to give up on her original plans and stayed in this small unique city for a while longer to discover even more wonderful things. The two passengers learned about this when they were chatting with her. Not only did they share neighboring seats, but they also chose to stay in the same hotel. They met in the morning. That hotel happened to be the same one our intelligence agent stayed in. It's called Iris's. Zio slowly nodded and said, "Have you investigated the lady's situation? What's her name?" "No, we can't be sure if she has left Utopia," answered the other MI9 member with a bushy goatee. Those two passengers only know that lady's name is Monica, but they don't know her last name or background. Zio tersely acknowledged. "Your subsequent mission is to investigate this lady's background, find her family and friends, and confirm if she has returned." "Yes, Colonel." The two MI9 personnel saluted and left Zio's office. Zio read the report they had submitted and sighed silently. Compared to her subordinates, she was actually closer to the truth of Utopia. She already knew that it was a ritual that had a certain connection with Gehrman Sparrow. However, she had no way of reporting this news to her superiors for credit. Without mentioning the origins of the information, Zio needed to consider whether Gehrman Sparrow was willing to let this news leak out. "Perhaps I can try contacting Gehrman Sparrow and ask him for his opinion." Zio tidied her desk in thought and left MI9. After changing her clothes, she returned to East Borough and the bridge area. She headed to different bars, just like back in her bounty hunter days, to gather all sorts of information from different people. During this process, she asked about Utopia in passing, but no one had heard of it. Finally, Zio entered a bar located in the Backlund Bridge area and sat on a high stool. She said to the bartender, "Anyone suspicious recently?" "A lot of people are suspicious, but they don't have any bounty," the bartender replied casually. Zio circled around this topic for more information, and when done, she asked according to plan, "Have you heard of Utopia?" I've heard of it, the bartender replied as he wiped the glass. Xiao moved her gaze from the bar counter up slowly. She looked at the bartender and asked, "Where from?" "There was a guest who came earlier, and he controlled his drinking," the bartender said indifferently. "I promoted our specialty cocktail to him. He said that he has other things to do, so he could only drink a glass of beer. I praised him and asked where he came from. He said, Utopia." Wendell had just finished his breakfast when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, he saw a police officer in a black and white checkered uniform standing outside. He opened the door in puzzlement. "Might I ask what's the matter?" Wendell asked politely. This house was a place he had been assigned to after coming to Backlund. This was because he would be staying in this city for quite some time, receiving internal investigations and monitoring. The police officer was still young and a little inexperienced. He was only in his early 20s. He forced a smile and said to Wendell, "Hello, I'm Biles, a police officer. There's a case that requires you to provide testimony in court." "What case?" Wendell frowned slightly. The young policeman named Biles said with a polite smile, "It's the Tracy homicide case in Utopia." Wendell's eyes widened. Chapter 1337. A chain reaction. At that moment, Wendell felt his calves tremble slightly, as if he could no longer support the weight of his body. After leaving Utopia, he had anticipated the worst possible outcome: sudden death with no explicable reason. However, he never expected that he would meet someone from Utopia in Backlund, a real large city. More importantly, the visitor had even invited him to Utopia. To Wendell, this was an extremely scary nightmare. Him not experiencing a mental breakdown could only be attributed to his good mental fortitude. Keeping his composure, Wendell forced a troubled expression and said, "I've had plenty of things to do recently." The police officer named Biles immediately said, "The trial will happen in 2 weeks. Here's the subpoena." As he spoke, he handed the document to Wendell. Frankly speaking, Wendell didn't want to accept it at all, but he had no choice but to accept it. Biles took a step back. "This concerns the future of a lady. I sincerely hope that you can testify in court." "It depends on the situation." Wendell didn't want to agree or refuse. Biles didn't say anything else as he bowed. "I'll wait for you in Utopia. I hope we meet again." With that said, he turned around and left the residence, entering the street. Throughout the entire process, Wendell seemed to have been frozen into an ice sculpture, standing there without blinking. After another 10 seconds, he finally woke up from his nightmare. He collapsed to the side weakly and held himself up by placing his right hand to the door. Just now, he had been so afraid that Biles would forcefully bring him back to the non-existent Utopia. If that happened, Wendell didn't know if he still had a chance to leave. Perhaps he would disappear forever. Compared to sudden death, this impossible-to-predict but clearly negative outcome left him even more fearful. "I need to quickly report this matter to the brass. Capture that policeman from Utopia and find out the real situation of this bizarre town and a suitable way to resolve the problem completely." Wendell snapped back to his senses and tried his best to perk himself up. He prepared to inform the MI9 members who were secretly monitoring him. At this moment, he finally realized that there was a huge problem with his response. He didn't grab the opportunity to inform his monitoring colleagues with a hand gesture that the police officer who had visited him was problematic. He didn't try to stall for time either. Instead, he waited for the monitors to realize that something was wrong. He also didn't show his talent as an intelligence agent, asking surreptitiously Biles which hotel he stayed in Backlund and what day he was setting off by train. He was so terrified that he could only subconsciously use a response that wouldn't create an accident. With that thought in mind, Wendell walked out of the door and looked in the direction where Biles had left, but he didn't even see his figure. This police officer from Utopia had already blended into the carriages and pedestrians. Retracting his gaze, Wendell looked down at the subpoena in his hand and suddenly felt a little uneasy. What will happen if I don't go to Utopia to testify 2 weeks later? The more Wendell thought about it, the more scared he became. His calves weakened again, and he hurriedly made a hand gesture to inform his colleagues that were hiding around him of the anomaly. Westboro, 9 Bellotto Street. After learning that a Utopia resident had arrived in Backlund, Xiao was both shocked and confused. According to her previous observations, Utopia was likely located in a secret location, or somewhere between real and illusory, allowing outsiders to enter through random entrances. As for why they wanted outsiders to enter, it was probably a ritual requirement. Therefore, according to Zio's understanding, the people of Utopia likely wouldn't leave their hometown and wander around. This is also a ritual requirement? What's the true identity of these residents? Mr. Fool's believers, the World Gairman Sparrow's companions? After Zio asked about the general appearance of the Utopia visitor, she had no choice but to return to MI9's headquarters due to the lack of further information. She hesitated on whether she should send her subordinates to perform a large-scale search. She wasn't sure if Mr. World would be happy to see such actions being taken, and she was afraid of affecting the ritual. After pacing back and forth in the office, Zio prepared to pray to Mr. Fool and ask him to transfer her questions to the World Gairman Sparrow. As she walked to the chair, Zio swept her gaze across the report placed on the table. It was an investigation report that her two subordinates had prepared. On the one hand, they had confirmed that there were no problems with the passengers that successfully arrived in Backlund. On the other hand, they had pointed out that there were passengers who had remained in Utopia. Passengers. Zio's eyes narrowed as she made a guess based on her intuition. That Utopia inhabitants had their own goals in coming to Backlund, and it wasn't for a random trip. And his goal is very likely related to a particular passenger who has left Utopia. Zio was alarmed as she hurriedly sat down and attempted to pray. Just then, someone knocked on her office door. "Please come in," Zio said after some hesitation. As the door opened, Zio saw the goateed Locke and Wendell, who was in charge of the Utopia incident. "Colonel, Wendell met someone from Utopia. He paid him a visit directly," Locke said, fumbling over his words. This development was equally unexpected. Indeed, Zio wasn't surprised. Instead, she secretly heaved a sigh of relief. She looked at Wendell and asked, "Why did he visit you?" "He requested that I head to Utopia to testify about the homicide case I mentioned in my report." Wendell was clearly calmer than before. He then added, "He's a policeman. Name's Biles. I don't dare ask where he was living. I don't know when he's planning to leave or which steam locomotive he's planning on taking to leave." To express the weight she had on this matter, Zio stood up and thought. "Locke, summon your team members to look for the rental carriage drivers who often prowl for customers around Wendell's residence, as well as the carriage drivers who passed by the nearby district, and ask if they've seen Biles before. If they have seen him, ask them where he was sent to. Also, send someone to the steam locomotive station and wait by the entrance to observe the passengers." After instructing her subordinates, Zio turned to look at Wendell. "Cooperate with them and sketch out Biles." "Yes, Colonel," Locke and Wendell replied in unison. After they left and closed the door, Zio sat back down and began to pray. Soon, she received Mr. Fool's response and saw the World Gairman Sparrow praying in the gray fog. Gairman Sparrow told her, "You can carry out normal investigations. When necessary, you can suggest that it's a ritual, but it must be included among a few options." Zio immediately heaved a sigh of relief as she patiently waited for her subordinates to report the results of their investigations. As night fell, Locke returned to Bellato Street and reported to Zio, "We found the rental carriage driver that took the Utopians' business." "Oh." Zio showed her concern. Locke explained simply, that Utopian originally got the carriage driver to go to the dock area. However, as soon as the carriage entered the corresponding area, he requested to get off, saying that they had arrived. That street was very unfamiliar to the carriage driver, making him feel like he was lost. After leaving that street, he realized that his surroundings had become familiar. Our men accompanied him to that place again, but he couldn't find that street no matter what. Zio nodded slightly and said solemnly, "It matches our preliminary descriptions regarding the entrances and exits of Utopia." "Colonel, are you saying that one can enter or leave Utopia from any city and street?" Locke was in disbelief. Zio thought for a moment before saying, "From the looks of it, yes. But I have a feeling that there's something wrong." "How does Utopia connect to different places? What does it rely on?" As her voice trailed off, Zio said to Locke, "Tell Wendell that he'll spend the following 2 weeks here until that subpoena expires." "Yes, Colonel." Locke turned around and left Zio's office. Wendell didn't have any objections to Colonel Derrychaw's arrangements. He could even say that he would only feel safe inside MI9's headquarters. His temporary residence was a simply refurbished duty room. Through the window, he could see the lawn, garden, and trees outside. At a glance, Wendell saw a pitch-black raven standing on a tree branch, silently looking over. Night in Bansi was abnormally creepy. From time to time, the cries of ravens or other seabirds could be heard. Verdu stood at the window, watching the approaching dilapidated dock and the city that had already been reduced to ruins. The pressure in his heart grew. After a few days at sea, the ship he boarded was about to reach Bansi harbor. The captain had already informed Verdu in the morning that they would only wait for 2 hours. If he exceeded the 2 hours, Verdu could only wait for the next ship on this deserted island. Who knew when the next ship would come? After taking a deep breath, Verdu retracted his gaze and took off his coat. Then he opened his suitcase, took out a classic black robe, and put it on. The surface of the robe was embroidered with golden and silver threads, and there were many gems the size of rice grains attached to it. It was a sealed artifact of the Abraham family. After making preparations, Verdu left the pirate ship and entered Bansi harbor. Along the way, the ancient robe tightened, causing his face to turn purple as he nearly fainted. As they walked, Verdu found the spot where the telegraph office stood based on the map he had bought. In the middle of the rubble, there were 2 bloody red marks, ones that remained fresh. It was as if they were left behind after 2 people were crushed into minced meat. Beside the 2 figures, on a broken wall, there was an octopus-headed monster wearing armor. It stood on waves and was holding a trident. Verdu raised the lantern in his hand high, and was about to take a closer look when he suddenly felt a drop of cold liquid land on his neck. Gripped with terror, he subconsciously reached out his hand. He found it sticky, nothing like rain. It was colorless. Not blood. It's a little similar to saliva. Verdu's forehead twitched slightly, and he slowly raised his head to look at the place where the drop of liquid could have dripped from. It was a swath of pitch black. It was the night sky without the moon or stars. Chapter 1338 Exploration. Verdu subconsciously swallowed his saliva, feeling an indescribable sense of fear. He didn't know what he was afraid of. There wasn't any real danger. Yet, a drop of unknown liquid falling from above was enough to chill his spine and tighten his pores. Perhaps it was because the environment was too eerie and silent, or perhaps it was because of the identity and unknown origins of the liquid. Verdu cautiously moved 2 steps outside and patiently observed. In the next few minutes, nothing abnormal happened. No more liquid fell from above. This made Verdu suspect that it was only a bird passing by. There was a freshwater fish from the island streams or a sea fish in its mouth, and a slightly sticky liquid dripped from its surface. He calmed himself and then checked on the ruins of the telegraph office. 10 minutes later, Verdu confirmed that there were only traces of blood and simple murals that were related to mysticism. It was worth researching. He didn't rashly extract samples of the blood-colored soil or make copies of the strange mural. Instead, he took out a pure dreamy crystal ball from his pocket. As an astrologer, he naturally had to use his best techniques to confirm if he should take action. Holding the crystal ball in his left hand, his right hand touched the top of the crystal ball as Verdu entered the state of an astrologer. In the next second, the crystal ball shone brightly. Bang! It exploded and scattered shards in every direction. Verdu's gaze froze. He stood rooted to the ground, completely ignoring the pain brought to him by the shards piercing into his body. It exploded. It actually exploded, he muttered to himself in disbelief. The crystal ball shards that stabbed into his body didn't seem to break through the classic robe. At that moment, they fell without any blood on them. Of course, there were a few shards left on Verdu's jaw and face, peppering them with small wounds. Who is it? Verdu suddenly came to his senses and turned to face another direction. In the ruins opposite him, a figure walked out. It was the woman in scantily clad clothes from the pirate ship. She had hidden herself very well and wasn't discovered by Verdu. However, the explosion from the crystal ball gave her a fright and made her react excessively, causing her to fail to maintain her hidden state. Verdu's injured face immediately twisted. "Why are you here?" The lady curled her lips and put on an indifferent attitude. "This is Bansi Harbor, not your home. Why can't I be here? I felt bored and came down to take a stroll, hoping to pick up some jewelry from the ruins. Is there any problem with that?" She retorted with a few questions without any intention of distancing herself from Verdu. Verdu didn't argue with her. He took out the medicine and medical alcohol that he had prepared beforehand and treated his facial and chin injuries. He then pulled out the crystal ball shards and put them back into his pocket. He didn't want his blood to remain in such a strange place. Following that, Verdu pulled on an accessory on the classic robe. It was a door-shaped symbol formed from 3 rubies, 3 emeralds, and 3 diamonds. In an instant, the long robe tightened, accentuating the flesh on Verdu's body. Just as Verdu's bones were about to be crushed, his figure gradually faded and he disappeared. Then, he teleported to the coastal mountain outside Bansi Harbor. The mountain had collapsed and turned into rubble. According to what Verdu knew, this was once the place where the Bansi residents used to worship the god of weather. It was also the main target of the Church of Storms. After the crystal ball exploded to warn him that the Bansi telegraph office was hiding an unknown danger, Verdu didn't dare to continue exploring the area or search for mysticism materials. He could only forcefully move to the next location. And this allowed him to escape the woman's tailing. As soon as Wilder's figure appeared, he bent down and took a deep breath. It was as if he had finally recovered from his suffocating state. At the same time, Verdu felt a sharp pain in his right rib, as if a bone had fractured. After taking several deep breaths, he endured the pain and walked a few steps forward with sweat on his forehead, arriving at the altar marked on the map. Without a doubt, the altar had been destroyed. There was only a glassified, slightly charred crater. There was gravel with different shapes scattered around it. The gravel had traces of being engulfed in fire and lightning to various degrees. After Verdu Abraham surveyed the area, he raised his right hand and waved his sleeve. With a whoosh, a small portion of the gravel was pushed away from the spot, revealing the ground beneath it. This was a trickmaster's wind trick. Verdu used it to replace the need for manual labor to fully ensure his safety. As the gravel flew, Verdu saw the charred ground. There were a few parts left in some areas that had extremely incomplete patterns, drawings, and symbols. The sound of the wind grew more intense as it resonated in Verdu's ears, causing him to look up in surprise. The wind that could only blow small gravel had somehow turned into a hurricane. It even pushed him into a state of staggering about. Wild clouds gathered in the sky, as if a storm was brewing. Although he had heard that Bansi was a weather museum, he had never thought that the changes would happen so suddenly. For a split second, Verdu suspected that his wine trick had triggered a storm, or perhaps it had caused some changes to the cleared ruins of the altar. This guess made his forehead break out into a cold sweat. As the storm raged, Verdu saw the rubble in front of him fly up, revealing a boulder that was buried underneath. The ordinary-looking wooden door was leaning against a collapsed wall with brass locks and handles. There were no corpses around it, nor were there any traces of blood. It was identical to the majority of the ruins. Indeed, he's exaggerating. Perhaps the pirate heard about this wooden door from somewhere else. Both he and his subordinates didn't dare to move it. Verdu looked around and suddenly said, "Who is it? Why are you monitoring me?" He actually didn't notice anyone around him, but based on his experience and lessons, he could use words and a reaction to deceive the possible presence of a monitor. A second later, a middle-aged man with a belly appeared in the shadows. He said nothing and silently left the place. Verdu heaved a sigh of relief as he didn't waste any time to approach the wooden door. According to the information he had obtained, no matter which way he opened the wooden door, it wouldn't bring about any abnormal changes. There would be no danger if he didn't attempt to move it. After thinking for a few seconds, Verdu retracted his hand into his sleeve and used his classical robe as a glove to pull the wooden door up. He raised the wooden door, and the surroundings fell silent. Verdu pushed the wooden door like he was normally opening a door, but there were no changes. He tried many other methods, but he failed to make the wooden door display any abnormalities. It seemed to have just been lucky to be preserved in its entirety under the bombardment of the Church of the Lord of Storms. Taking a deep breath, Verdu tried to calm himself down. He thought for a moment and tried to open the door again. However, unlike before, he held the handle and gently twisted it down. After hearing the light click of metal colliding, Verdu pushed the wooden door backward and let it lean against a collapsed wall. This time, a grayish-white fog appeared before Verdu. In the fog, there was a faintly discernible street and a row of terraces. Outside one of the houses, there was a wooden signboard. On them were a few Loanese words, "Bansi Harbor Telegraph Office." While Verdu's pupils dilated, a calm voice sounded from the telegraph office that was shrouded in fog. "Are you here to send a telegram? Please come in." Chapter 1339. Behind the door. Although the voice coming from the telegraph office wasn't anything out of the ordinary, it was just a little intermittent. It lacked the obvious changes in tone. Normally, it wouldn't strike terror in others, but Verdu's heart suddenly erupted with a surge of fear. It was like a bullet with flames shooting into an ammunition dump. It accurately hit a barrel of flammable gunpowder and ignited the fear that Verdu had accumulated and suppressed previously. The horror that swept into every corner of his body was like a hand that grabbed Verdu's heart and blanked out his brain. He turned around abruptly and ran frantically towards the remnant pier where the pirate ship was. During this process, Verdu had completely forgotten to think. He didn't remember wearing a classic robe that could teleport. All he did was run through the ruins with his feet, occasionally tripping over random items and falling heavily to the ground. Sometimes, his face would turn purple from his tightening clothes, and he had no choice but to stop to catch his breath. However, every time he composed himself a little, he would crawl up and continue running. He looked like he had lost his rationality and was acting purely on instinct. Without the force he provided, the wooden door couldn't maintain its balance. It slid down from the collapsed wall and fell to the floor covered with bricks. The grayish-white fog and the shadowy houses disappeared. After 5 minutes, Verdu ran back to the pier under the storm. His eyes were wide open, filled with panic and confusion. He didn't notice that there was a figure standing on the deck of the pirate ship, quietly looking down at him. This was the young man wearing a half-top hat and a long black trench coat. He had a cold expression. Verdu didn't even think about it and immediately used the gangway to return to the pirate ship. He rushed into the cabin and rushed to the second floor before rushing into his room. Bang! He slammed the door shut and curled up on the small narrow bed. He wrapped himself tightly with the blanket and shivered. When another of his ribs fractured again, the excruciating pain struck him and he finally recovered from his horror. He realized that his limbs were sore and his body was hot. Every breath he took was like thunder. He struggled with all his might, and finally, he took off his classic robe and fell back into the bed. He felt dizzy and nauseous. The air just felt insufficient. Outside the cabin, the cold-looking man suddenly raised his hand. He took out a human-skinned glove and wore it on his left palm. Suddenly, the man vanished into thin air and appeared in a corner of the ruins. He appeared beside the ordinary wooden door. He bent down and raised the wooden door, allowing it to stand in front of the collapsed wall. Right on the heels of that, the man in the black trench coat mimicked Verdu's actions. He reached out for the handle and twisted it downwards. Then, he pushed the wooden door forward and let it lean against the wall. Almost at the same time, he saw a grayish-white fog. He saw the faintly discernible streets and houses in the fog. Amidst the houses, the clearest, most eye-catching one was the Bansi Harbor Telegraph Office. The rest were more or less blurry. At this moment, the calm voice in the telegraph office asked through the door, "Who are you?" "I'm Gehrman Sparrow," the young man in a half-top hat replied in the same staccato. The interior of Bansi Harbor Telegraph Office suddenly fell silent as though someone was walking silently towards the door. At that moment, Gehrman Sparrow turned his head to the other side. In the deep end of the street, a figure walked over. He was wearing a straw hat and had a towel around his neck. He was bending over to pull something. As the figure approached, the outline of the object behind him gradually became clear. It was a black vehicle with 2 wheels. It had a roof that could block the scorching sun and rain. In the vehicle sat a lady wearing a waist-length dress with an embroidered fan. Both she and the driver were concealed by thick fog, making it difficult for anyone to see their exact appearances. When they passed Gehrman Sparrow, he barely managed to see a few details through the fog. The hunched man pulling the carriage had a rotten face with pale yellow pus flowing. In areas where the lady wasn't covered by the fan and clothes, her skin was swollen with a glisten amidst many blue and black spots. With a ring, a bell sounded. A blue train with 2 carriages sped out from in front of Gehrman Sparrow. At this moment, Gehrman Sparrow realized that there was an iron-black track on the ground. Above him were long lines. On the top of the train carriage, there was a rather complicated metal frame that slid over the long lines. Through the glass window of the train, Gehrman Sparrow saw the passengers inside. They faced the streets, but only their heads remained. Each head was dragging a bloody spine. Gehrman Sparrow's pupils dilated as he silently watched this scene without moving for a long time. After nearly a minute, he took a step forward in an attempt to enter the blurry street beneath the grayish-white fog. However, the fog blocked him. No matter what method he used, he couldn't pass through it. 15 minutes later, Gehrman Sparrow stopped his attempts and closed the wooden door, eliminating the fog. Then, he dragged the wooden door and teleported directly to the pirate ship. He wasn't worried about being cursed at all. He then placed the wooden door on the deck and reached out his left hand again to grab the door handle. Suddenly, there was a cracking sound from Gehrman Sparrow's neck. His head seemed to be raised by an invisible hand as it dragged out a bloody spine. Gehrman Sparrow's expression didn't change as he coldly raised his right hand and pressed it above his head, pressing his head back to its original position. Immediately after, he turned the handle as though unaffected and pushed the wooden door open again, allowing it to lean against the shipboard. However, this time, there was no grayish-white fog to be seen, nor were there any visible streets, houses, or trains. It could be said that there was nothing unusual. In the next second, the wooden door rapidly decayed, turning into a pile of mud, as if it was trying to avoid the fate of being tested. Gehrman Sparrow didn't stop it. He took out a golden ring embedded with a ruby and wore it for nearly 10 seconds. After the ring vanished, Gehrman Sparrow reached out with his right hand and pulled out the same ordinary wooden door from the void before continuing his attempts. After confirming that the wooden door would lose its effects once it left Bansi, Gehrman Sparrow casually waved his hand, allowing it to vanish in midair. 2 hours later, the dark clouds in the sky gradually dissipated. The storm that had been brewing for a long time ultimately did not descend. When the pirate ship was far away from Bansi Harbor, Verdu, who had finished treating his injuries, took a bottle of medicine and allowed himself to quickly fall asleep so that he could adjust his mental state. In the hazy dream world, he ran in a desolate moor, looking for something frantically, but he found nothing. Suddenly, Verdu heard a faint voice coming from deep in the moor. The great god of war. The symbol of iron and blood. The ruler of chaos and strife. This sentence repeated over and over again, but it didn't alarm Verdu enough to snap him out of his dreams. After some time, Verdu woke up and opened his eyes. At that moment, the morning sun shone into the cabin outside the window, bringing with it a faint light. Verdu slowly sat up and realized that he didn't need to use the powers of an astrologer to recall the 3 lines of the honorific name that he had heard in his dream. And his relatively rich mysticism knowledge told him that it was referring to a hidden existence at the level of a deity. Is this the result of the incomplete symbols and labels around the altar, or a result of me witnessing that street in the grayish-white fog? Verdu frowned and fell into deep thought. He didn't rashly attempt to recite that honorific name, because he knew how miserable people who had done something like that had died. God of War. Verdu vaguely remembered that he had seen this deity's name in a book in his family. He decided to do some research before considering how to deal with it later. Bansi Haba, on the collapsed coastal mountain. Red, blazing white, or orange flames emerged from the crevices of the gravel, forming a figure. This figure was wearing a black blood-stained armor, with a half-grown fiery red hair. He looked young and handsome. There was a blood-colored mark on his glabella that resembled a flag. There were traces of decay on his face. It was none other than the Red Angel evil spirit, Sauron Einhorn Medici. If he didn't have Saphira Castle and an attendant of mysteries characteristic to allow his marionettes to run around the world without considering the limitations of distance, I wouldn't need to take such a roundabout route. The Red Angel evil spirit Sked, a mystery as to who he was speaking with. In midair, a raven landed on the top of a boulder. There was a circle of white on its right eye, and a human voice sounded from its mouth. You actually used him, and not him. This isn't like your style. The Red Angel evil spirit chuckled. That's because he wishes others to call him as him, and not him. As he spoke, Sauron Einhorn Medici glanced at the raven. This form of yours looks cuter than your true self, don't you think? Lil Raven? The white-eyed raven replied without any hint of anger. Your mockery is just like you. Still living in the previous epoch. The Red Angel evil spirit smiled and said, The developments have been rather smooth, and he has been fooled. However, I believe that even if he discovers it, he will probably turn a blind eye. For the two of you to become great old ones, Dor has to return. The hypocritical him might still be hesitating about whether to do it, because if he isn't careful, it will bring about a huge disaster. Haha, I like disasters. Lil Raven, when are you going to make your payment? If you don't have enough strength, I won't be able to gain the trust of the brainless Abraham. When he prays to you, said the white-eyed raven. If you're worried that such a state won't last long, I can parasitize a worm of time into your body and help you maintain it. There's no need to thank me. As he spoke, the raven spread its wings and disappeared into the vast night sky. The red angel evil spirit turned his head and, with the advantage of the terrain, wore a solemn expression as he looked down at the Bansi ruins. Chapter 1340 Travel Diaries. This small city called Utopia is intrinsically no different from the ones I had been to in the past. Be it the folk culture, the people, or architectural style, it follows very closely to the standard loan styles. I've heard that the southern continent has many peculiar and unusual traditions. I hope that I can experience it myself one day. Of course, that's after East and West Balam's peace is restored. Speaking of which, the most special thing about this place is that the weather is always changing and there's always a storm. As a result, most people have umbrellas and raincoats that are smeared with Donningsman tree sap. The hotel attendant told me that for a person of a certain income level, which also has a need to work outdoors, they would have to save quite a sum of money to purchase a raincoat. Otherwise, the sickness would only take more away. There are no meteorologists here. I have no idea why there are so many changes in the weather here. I can only guess that it has something to do with it lining the sea and being close to places with hurricanes. Yes, there's a deep water harbor a few kilometers away from Utopia. However, they're lacking in manpower, and it isn't very well managed. It can only maintain its operations on a small scale. They don't have local newspapers either. After all, it's just a small city with a few thousand people. The paperboys mainly sell the Tussock Times, Desi Mirror, and Seawind News. The second reason I like this place is because many people in Utopia are optimistic and are very enthusiastic about life. When I wrote this down, a band happened to pass by outside the hotel. It's not a professional band, but a group formed purely from amateur enthusiasts. Among them, there are civil servants, law enforcement officers, solicitors, professional policemen, school teachers, candy factory workers, shop owners. Among them, those with the money are responsible for the larger musical instruments, such as cello, violins, and other difficult musical instruments. The lower and middle-class citizens use relatively simple instruments like 7-string guitars and harmonicas. On some rest days, they will walk the streets and set off from the municipal square. They will circle the city before returning to the St. Ariana Cathedral near the square. They call this a musical tour. In the tour, not only do they not reject other citizens from joining, but they even encourage them to sing or dance along with the procession. According to my observations, the participants are very happy and very satisfied as they freely express their love for life. This gives me a feeling of being full of vigor. I have to admit that it's very infectious. I've tried to join the tour, and I've forgotten my troubles in the revelry of music, dancing, and singing. I only remember happiness. They aren't on a tour today. Instead, they're showering their blessings to a newlywed couple at the cathedral. Speaking of weddings, what I don't understand the most is that it only has the Evernight Goddess's cathedral. One ought to know that in most of the kingdom, even in a small town, there would be at least 2 cathedrals, one belonging to the Evernight Goddess and the other, the Lord of Storms. Before today, I couldn't imagine that an ordinary town in the kingdom would only believe in one deity. However, this doesn't cause too much trouble for me. Before I turned 18, I could only believe in the Lord of Storms under the influence of my family. However, after I graduated from grammar school, I came to truly understand that the goddess is the most compassionate and benevolent deity. Back to the wedding. I participated in a wedding a couple of days ago. I discovered that Utopia has some special customs in this area. Out of all of them, what I admire the most is that when the priest pronounces them man and wife, the groom and bride will bow to each other. No one is superior in this relationship as they only sincerely express their gratitude to be able to spend the rest of their lives together. This might be an expression of equality between man and woman in the goddess's teachings. In addition, there will be some special game segments after the wedding. For example, let the groom and the bride publicly describe their love story. This may be a rather embarrassing matter for them, but to the guests, it's rather interesting. Yes, I think so too, but I definitely won't add similar segments to my wedding. At the wedding, I heard the best love story I've heard so far. If there's a chance, and if you my dear readers of this particular column enjoy it, I'll consider retelling it. Of course, I'll change the names and some details to prevent the couple from feeling troubled. The most important reason why I like Utopia is its food. The food here is very delicious. The limited number of restaurants are all very good, and the best is undoubtedly the attached restaurant to the Irises hotel I'm staying at. Be it the most basic beefsteak, fried pig chop, charcoal barbecued meat, spiced fried fish, or even more complicated, more difficult stewed mutton with peas, thick cream soup, butter potatoes, and roasted potato skin, all of them have reached the level of a master chef in the city. In addition, the chefs here are quite skilled in creating unique dishes and food. There are sweet and sour meat cubes, and grilled fish smeared with various condiments. In the staples that don't seem to allow for experimentation, the chefs of Utopia haven't given up. I've eaten all kinds of toasts in this city. Yam, potatoes, butter, creamed, and ones with fruits. As long as I was willing to, I could make it so that I don't eat the same thing twice during the week. The best food of praise here is their desserts. Cream pudding, fruit pudding, black forest cakes, carrot cakes, milk cakes, muffins, egg tarts. I feel hungry writing this. This is the reason why I still don't wish to leave after staying here for a week. What I'm most worried about now is not my wallet but my weight. I'm glad that the hotel doesn't have a weight scale, and at the same time, I blame them for not including one. The red wine in Utopia is also rather outstanding. The only problem is that they lack the age to settle down. It seems like the vineyards around the city haven't realized this. Here, I need to seriously recommend a drink. Utopia's Fizzling Iced Tea. It's very special, and it has an even more amazing experience besides the sweetness and bubbles. Every night, I would go for a stroll in the municipal square. That's also the place where most Utopians like to go for entertainment. They have an extraordinary love for the pigeons. I met an artist at the municipal square. His name is Anderson. He's handsome, and his artistic skills are superb. Unfortunately, he's a mute. I also know another writer. His name is Alzu. It's a rather strange name. He said that he's writing a long novel and asked me to appraise the beginning. I won't comment on his novel, but I was just curious about a few familiar names at the beginning of the novel. It included Anderson Wendy. Oh yes, this is the boss of my favorite bakery. I raised this question, and Alza told me very seriously that when a writer can't think of names for characters, it's very reasonable for them to use someone they know as reference. I agree. Since this column is too narrow to contain my thoughts, I'll end it here. Love, Charlotte. Monica put down her fountain pen and seriously read the manuscript twice. She changed certain words and any grammatical errors. She was a writer. She wasn't famous at first, so she could only rely on writing third-rate romance novels to maintain her life. After she changed her faith to the Evernight goddess, her father had almost cut off all ties with her. However, ever since Miss Fur's Wall, who had written Stormwind Mountain Villa, established a travel column, and had received quite a warm response after the war, Monica had also started to write about her travels in some Backland newspapers. This perfectly matched her hobby, and her hobby gave her a unique vitality to help her become a famous travel columnist. Charlotte was her pen name. After her writing dried completely, Monica specially wrote another copy and stuffed it into an envelope before affixing it with a stamp. After confirming that the address was correct, the black-haired lady with a Desi Bay style carried her handbag and left the hotel, heading to the Utopia post office. The post office was next to the telegraph office. Whenever Monica passed by the latter, she would always find it a waste. From her point of view, Utopia rarely needed to send telegrams. It was too extravagant to specially build a telegraph office. After sending the letter, Monica looked at the sky and walked towards the municipal square. When she arrived at the entrance of St. Ariana's Cathedral, she met Biles. He was a police officer. He had once questioned Monica at the Irises Hotel due to the homicide witness. Unfortunately, Monica didn't know that man named Wendell. After greeting each other with a nod, Monica entered the cathedral and found a seat. She listened quietly to the sermon of the priest named Townsend. This was a priest she found to be most clergyman-like ever since she changed her faith to the Evernight goddess. His hair was half white, and he spoke slowly and mellowly. His voice was deep and low, always calming down people without them realizing it. Monica closed her eyes and listened attentively to the sermon. East Chester County. In a forest belonging to the Hall family. Alfred, Hibbert, and Audrey led their respective foxhounds with their servants around the forest and chased after their prey. This was the first time the three of them had hunted together since they became adults. In front of their sister, Alfred and Hibbert had a great time, at least on the surface. And to Alfred, the biggest problem was how to control himself and not show that he was too extraordinary. Otherwise, if a disciplinary paladin were to join the hunt, no one else would have the chance. He knew that his sister was a Beyonder, but he also knew that a Sequence 7 Beyonder of the Spectator pathway didn't have any actual combat ability. As they chased their prey, they rushed out of the forest and saw a wheat field. "Where are we?" Audrey, dressed in hunting gear, asked casually. This was her first time hunting in this forest, and she didn't know where it led to. Hibbert wasn't too familiar with the area as well. He turned his head and said to his attendant, "Ask someone." As they waited, the three siblings laughed as they discussed their trophies. As for the golden retriever, Susie, she glanced at the foxhounds that wanted to get close to her and made them distance themselves. After a while, Hibbert's attendant returned and reported, "Sir, there's a village called Heartlark nearby." "Heartlark? That village with the dragon worship customs? I came here from somewhere else?" Audrey was taken aback when she heard that. Chapter 1341. In the dream. After regaining her senses, Audrey maintained her faint smile as she became wary. She could vaguely feel a mysterious force pushing her to Heartlark, the village with the tradition of dragon worship. This was like an arrangement of fate. Audrey had once entered the Hall of Truth, and she discovered that the murals inside had turned into reality. Furthermore, she knew that the Spectator Pathway's Sequence 1 was author. From this name, she had made some connections, so it was inevitable for her to suspect that something was amiss. At this moment, Hibbert laughed. "I've heard of this village. I remember that our family has a manor nearby." As he spoke, he looked up at the sky. "It's almost evening. Why don't we stay there and continue hunting tomorrow?" Alfred wasn't opposed to his elder brother's suggestion. To him, staying the night at whichever manor was essentially the same. He nodded and said, "Send someone back to inform father and mother." Audrey didn't say a word. Her green eyes turned slightly, and her gaze swept across the faces of her two brothers. Hibbert's brows immediately furrowed as he said, "I think it's best we return." This manor wasn't informed in advance, so they definitely weren't prepared. Perhaps there's no way for them to service so many horses, hounds, and servants. Besides, there's still an hour before the evening. There's enough time for us to return. When Alfred saw his brother change his mind so quickly, he wanted to act contrary to him. However, on second thought, he felt that what his brother said made sense. Considering that his sister was also here, he tersely agreed and said, "Then let's head back quickly." With that said, he didn't wait for Hibbert. Squeezing at the horse's side and brandishing the horsewhip, he led the way. Hibbert frowned, then relaxed. Without saying anything else, he led his sister, the group of attendants, servants, and hounds, and turned around, following the edge of the forest and returning to a manor on the other side. Audrey quietly followed behind him, not expressing her opinion on the development of the matter. Late at night, in a manor in East Chester County, having used her manipulator powers to change the thoughts of her two brothers to prevent them from approaching Heartlark, Audrey lifted the velvet blanket and crawled into bed, entering a deep sleep. In her reverie, she suddenly sat up. She then looked around and saw the familiar dressing table and the bathroom entrance. She realized that she was still in the room, but the crimson moon outside the window was gone. There were no stars, only darkness. This isn't the real world. Audrey instantly made a judgment and inspected herself. Soon, she came to a conclusion. This was a dream. It was a rather strange dream that made her remain lucid. "It's really here." Audrey didn't feel any panic. She was just a little vexed. She hadn't handled the development properly in the afternoon, which led to the problem extending to the manor where her parents were. In hindsight, she believed that she should have followed Hibbert's idea and headed straight to the family manor near Heartlark. Then she could reasonably arrange for Hibbert and Alfred to return here, leaving her to stay behind and wait for any possible developments. This way, even if anything happened, it wouldn't affect their parents, brothers, and most of the servants. However, at that time, her main goal wasn't to follow the arrangement of fate. As long as she could avoid Heartlark, she would try her best to avoid it. To her surprise, danger would, at times, spring on you even if you didn't seek it out. To avoid it and stall for time wasn't a universal solution. Audrey immediately got off the bed and stood barefoot on the thick carpet. She had already confirmed that, with her level of a demigod as a dreamwalker, She could directly escape this strange dream and return to the real world, avoiding the suspected invitation once more. After looking around, Audrey pursed her lips, removed the blue cloak hanging on the clothes rack beside her, and wore it. She took a deep breath and walked towards the door. During this process, a crimson star tattoo appeared on the back of her hand. The tattoo vanished as though it had never appeared. This was the mark left on her after her first entry into the ancient palace above the grey fog. For a very long time, it hadn't shown any special traits. It was only at the beginning of this year that Mr. Fool informed them that in situations in which they couldn't pray, they could use the triggering of the corresponding tattoo to skip the chanting of the honorific name. Simply put, this was a treatment that a blessed of a deity enjoyed. Of course, there was no way to transmit any information. It could only be used in critical situations, allowing Mr. Fool to cast his gaze over. And more importantly, the star-like crimson mark was rather eye-catching. It could be easily discovered by others and people who were secretly monitoring them. Therefore, under a situation where she needed to hide her uniqueness, Audrey was more inclined to use the various abilities of a manipulator to implant the idea of praying to Mr. Fool to some inconspicuous human nearby. She got them to complete the prayer at suitable times and locations and pray for her protection. At this moment, she believed that the owner of the dreamscape knew that she was problematic, so she felt that there was no need to go through all that trouble. All she needed to do was to hide the entity she was praying to. When she reached the door, Audrey reached out for the handle and gently twisted it before pulling it backward. The slightly dark corridor entered her vision. The main building of this manor had a history of over 100 years. Many places still had their former characteristics, especially the corridor section. It didn't have any gas lamps, and the walls were decorated with candlestands made of silver or copper. There were countless candles placed on them, emitting a dim yellow light that illuminated the entire corridor and creating all kinds of shadows. They gave a feeling that a phantasm might appear on the corridor at any moment. Even this has been replicated in the dreamscape. Audrey looked around and entered the corridor. As this thought flashed across her mind, a long, thick pale yellow carpet appeared beneath her feet. Stepping on the carpet, Audrey followed her spiritual intuition and walked to the right. After taking 2 or 3 steps, she suddenly stopped. She felt as if there was something hidden behind the 2 tightly shut doors, giving her a strong desire to explore. This is Father and Mother's bedroom. That is Hibbert's room. That is Alfred's room. Audrey made a slight note of it and frowned. The ancient doors with relief were extremely mysterious under the dim candlelight. It made one eager to know what was hidden behind them. As her thoughts raced, Audrey suddenly understood what they represented in a dream. This was the door to the mind world. Behind each door was the mind world of their owner. In other words, after Audrey pushed open Alfred's door, she would see the various secrets hidden deep in his heart. By the same logic, she could pry into the secrets of Lord Hall and Lady Caitlin. She slowly retracted her gaze. Audrey closed her eyes and continued walking forward, preventing herself from being affected. After all her experiences, she gradually understood a principle. A demigod in the mind domain needed to control themselves and respect others. Under the premise that she could read people's true thoughts through their body language, facial expressions, and emotional fluctuations, if she wasn't satisfied, she could greedily explore the inner thoughts of others and dig out their secrets. In the end, she would suffer a backlash. This was a very simple principle. Everyone had some darkness in them in varying amounts or nasty thoughts. However, they had control over them, preventing them from affecting their actions. Under such circumstances, if a demigod in the mind domain still insisted on digging these thoughts and dug out the ugly parts under the mask, it was very easy for them to be disappointed in human nature, be tainted by all kinds of negative thoughts, gradually becoming crazy without realizing it. This was also one of the reasons why, despite spectators being able to placate themselves and treat corresponding mental problems, they were also one of the pathways who would easily go mad or lose their composure. They were both safe and dangerous. Therefore, Audrey established rules for herself to observe. She only did observations and read the minds of people she knew. She tried her best not to enter their dreams. This restriction didn't apply to strangers. If it wasn't necessary, she wouldn't enter the mind world of anyone. Following the corridor, Audrey, who was wearing a blue cloak, reached its end. She opened her eyes and cast her gaze at the room on the left. It was a half-open solarium. Pursing her lips again, Audrey held the door handle with her breathing steady. As the wooden door opened, the scene inside was gradually revealed. This was no longer a room. On the ground were round pebbles and bundles of bluish-black weeds. It was so dark deep within that space that one couldn't see clearly. Audrey slowly walked in and closed the door behind her. In the darkness, the silhouettes of some objects were quickly outlined. A huge stone pillar that was tens of meters tall stood there. There was a tall lizard-like monster situated above it. The monster was squatting at the top of the stone pillar like a tiny mountain. Its body was covered with huge grayish-white stone scales, and its eyes were pale-fold and vertical. This was a mind dragon as spoken in myths. With a whoosh, the two wings of the mind dragon spread open, almost covering the entire sky. Their bones were like metallic leaf veins, covered with a gray membrane with mysterious patterns. As Audrey looked up, the mind dragon emitted a buzzing sound. "You've been to Liveseed." Without a doubt, it used Dragonese. City of Miracles. Liveseed. How does it know? Just as Audrey had these two thoughts, she heard the mind dragon say, "Everyone's consciousness in one's heart will make a certain exchange with the sea of collective subconscious. And for a unique place like Liveseed, it likewise left a special impression in you. When your virtual persona roams the sea of collective subconscious and isn't too far from me, I can naturally sense this. This exceeds the limits of my abilities, and it's not something a dreamweaver can do. This mind dragon corresponds to a sequence 2 discerner? He actually didn't directly control me." As Audrey's thoughts flashed, the mind dragon spoke again. "I'm sure you don't have any ill intentions at the moment." Audrey fell silent for 2 seconds before looking up and asking, "Aren't you worried that it's a trap?" Chapter 1342. Simultaneously at that moment, Audrey even suspected that the arrangement of fate wasn't for her to head to Heartlark to investigate the dragon-worshipping customs. Instead, it was to make her realize that something was wrong, causing her to feel conflicted. It made her use a virtual persona in the vicinity of Heartlark to secretly guide her two brothers into changing their minds without realizing it. This would inevitably result in her consciousness being specially related to Liveseed to be discovered by the mind dragon, thus attracting him. Despite being the one that had been arranged, Audrey couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. It had to be said that to achieve such an effect, one had to have an extremely high level of confidence in the reactions different people had. It struck fear into the bottom of her heart. After all, Audrey, a Sequence 4 manipulator, had felt that the development of the matter was in line with her expectations. She had completely fulfilled her wishes and wasn't alert at all. The mind dragon retracted its huge wings and looked down at the blue-cloaked Audrey. This is a dream maze formed by many minds. Even if the one who set the trap personally descends, it will take some time to find this room. Besides, I won't stay long. Clearly, he had been wary of traps, but he believed that certain matters were worth the risk. Dream maze. This is a beyonder power of a dreamweaver, or perhaps the power after qualitative change. Audrey reined in her thoughts and asked calmly, "What do you wish to know?" The gigantic grayish-white dragon buzzed and said, "My name is Arihog, one of the 3 remaining ancient dragons." He means that he is one of the 3 surviving dragons of the second epoch, and the rare, known dragons are only descendants of the dragons during the era of the ancient gods? Audrey nodded slightly and didn't interrupt him. Behind her was a wooden door that stood without any support in the plains filled with bluish-black weeds. It looked extremely strange. Arihog didn't waste any time. After introducing himself, he asked, "Where did you find Liveseed?" Audrey was already prepared as she answered frankly, "In a book named Grozel's Travels. Rumor has it that it was personally created by the Dragon King Ankwelt." Grozel. Arihog clearly hadn't heard of this name before. After repeating it, he pressed, "What kind of book is that?" The blonde-haired Audrey gave a simple description. "That's a book with a world that's almost real inside it. At the same time, it can suck in people who meet the requirements or offer their own blood to be sucked in by the book, allowing them to live in that world." Arihog fell silent for 2 seconds. "Is there a sea of collective subconscious in that book world?" "Yes," Audrey answered with great certainty. The City of Miracles Liveseed, I saw was deep in the sea of collective subconscious in the book world. Arihog suddenly breathed harder. "What did you see in that Liveseed?" Audrey recalled and said, "A city filled with towering pillars and majestic palaces. In addition, I've also entered the residence of the Dragon King." That place can allow every living being's inner thoughts to echo in the surrounding area. I call it the Hall of Truth. At the end of the Hall of Truth, behind the Dragon King's throne, there's an ancient and mysterious bronze door. I'm not sure what's sealed behind. In short, it's very dangerous and I didn't dare approach it at all. Audrey was speaking the complete truth. She just didn't mention the speculations that Mr. World, Mr. Star, and she had come up with. Hog fell completely silent. It was unknown what he was thinking of, or if he was analyzing the current situation regarding Liveseed. During this process, his head drooped down bit by bit, as though he was going to fall from the top of a 100-meter-tall pillar to the ground. Just as Audrey tensed up from this rather bizarre scene and was about to ask a question, Hog suddenly raised his head. The golden vertical pupil in his eyes turned colder as his voice once again resounded in the wilderness. Liveseed. With a low rumbling of thunder, the things that were hidden in the dock behind Hog quickly became clear. In the gradually brightening scene, their outlines appeared. They were huge stone pillars that were more than 100 meters tall. They were either standing alone or collectively propping up numerous majestic and ancient palaces. These stone pillars and palaces were mainly grayish-white in color as they landed on the island-like foundations. It was identical to the City of Miracles, Liveseed, which Audrey had just described. No, this was probably the City of Miracles, Liveseed. Only then did Audrey realize that the ancient mind dragon Hog was squatting at the top of the thickest, tallest stone pillar. At this moment, she could faintly feel a subtle change in Hog. Her green eyes darted about slightly, and the sound of a metal handle being twisted sounded from behind her. This. Audrey held back the urge to turn her head abruptly. She turned her body warily to the side, allowing her gaze to fall sideways. The individual wooden door that had lost its external support slowly opened, revealing the visitor's appearance. A huge white rabbit with wiggling ears that walked upright. Above the gray fog, in the ancient palace, a figure was shrouded in grayish-white fog. He sat at the fool's seat at the end of the long mottled table as he silently observed the crimson star representing justice. Backlund, West Borough, 9 Bellotto Street. The closer Wendell was to the end of the 2 weeks, the more he suffered from insomnia. He had to rely on medication to fall asleep. When he woke up, he was also restless and extremely anxious. He had lost all interest in food and only forced himself to eat the 3 meals sent by his colleagues to ensure his energy. He didn't know what would happen on the date of the trial, nor did he know if there would be an irreversible change in his body. This kind of fear towards the unknown often made him feel stifled. It was extremely tortuous. Sometimes, Wendell would even think that it might not be a wise choice resisting his return to Utopia. Based on his limited experience there, if he obediently returned to Utopia and testified in court, there was a high chance that he would leave safely. At least up to this point, Wendell hadn't heard of anyone dying or going crazy because of Utopia. The people there were rather friendly apart from being a little bizarre. I'm just going to help. They should be grateful to me instead of being antagonistic. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it would be more comfortable to face the danger. Of course, he had no doubts about MI9's protective capabilities. If it wasn't possible, he felt that he could only consider meeting the Lord of Storms early. Phew. Wendell exhaled and sat down on his chair. He casually picked up a novel to pass time. However, his frustration made it impossible for him to immerse himself in the plot. He flipped through the pages more frequently and finally, he snapped the book close. He closed his eyes and prepared to take a nap. In a daze, Wendell seemed to return to Utopia and arrived at the court. However, the role he was in wasn't as a witness but a member of the audience. Tracy was deemed by the judge to have provided insufficient evidence to support a claim for self-defense and had been transferred to the criminal courts. He saw this lady tearing up in a daze, her smile extremely miserable. Wendell woke up and stared silently at the wall lamp in front of him. He sat there motionless for a long time. If the problem is Utopia, and not the residents of Utopia, then me avoiding it might end up killing a poor lady. Wendell retracted his gaze. His resolve had wavered slightly, but he was unable to overcome the fear in his heart. With his hands on the table, he stood up and walked to the door. He planned to wander about MI9's headquarters to ease his mood. After leaving the room and taking a few steps forward, Wendell suddenly heard a colleague in the office discussing the related case of the Utopia. Have you heard? The person who entered Utopia was a carriage driver. He sent a merchant from Utopia to the dock area, and with just taking 2 turns at a crossroads, he found himself somewhere unfamiliar. There's a need to warn all the carriage drivers in Backland. Yes, it's best to draw a parallel between Utopia and the spies so that they can understand. The way of entering and exiting Utopia is really frightening. Yes. Sometimes, I even suspect that the entrance to Utopia might appear anywhere. There's definitely a limit to this. It's not as omnipotent as we imagine. Otherwise, I might find myself in Utopia just by paying a visit to the washroom. According to the current patterns we've figured, this is theoretically valid. When Wendell heard that, his blood vessels on his forehead began to throb. He suddenly felt that even if he was in the headquarters of MI9, he wouldn't be that safe. Unless there's a demigod watching me the entire time, it's very difficult for me to avoid the fate of returning to Utopia. Perhaps, after I wash my hands and open the washroom door, I'll discover that it's the Iris's hotel outside. No, ordinary demigods might not be able to stop such a thing. This doesn't seem like it's something humans can accomplish. It's already extremely close to that of a deity. Wendell instantly panicked, unable to suppress the fear in his heart. He returned to the room and took out the subpoena from the Utopian court. Immediately following that, Wendell entered the washroom and held the document as he muttered in fear, "I'm willing to go to court to testify. I'm willing to go to court to testify." After repeating himself a few times, he reached out to grab the handle of the bathroom door. At that moment, a black raven flew through the ventilation hole like a ghost and landed in a corner of the washroom that no one would notice. In the next second, Wendell twisted the handle, pulled the door back, and opened the washroom door. It was no longer his familiar bedroom but an unfamiliar lobby. Chapter 1343 Weaved Nightmare. I really returned to Utopia. Upon seeing the scene outside, Wendell felt a baffling sense of relief and ease. He no longer had any doubts about his choice to go to testify in court. It had to be known that he was in the washroom of MI9's headquarters. It was a place that was impossible to invade even with a fully armed army. Wendell slowly exhaled as he walked out of the washroom and towards the entrance of the lobby. Behind him, in a corner of the washroom where no one was paying attention to, the pitch-black raven had draped over a shadow-like veil, losing its physical presence. Even if one were to directly look at it, it would be difficult to discover it. Then, its body became more and more transparent as it rapidly dissipated until it vanished. At this moment, Wendell had already walked a few meters out of the lobby when he saw a police officer in a black and white checkered uniform. This was the young officer who had requested him to testify, Biles. "I knew you'd come, because you're a kind person." Biles smiled at Wendell. When he heard the compliment, Wendell's strung-up heart finally returned to normal. Then, he instinctively turned his head back and saw that the bathroom that he had come out of had changed completely in style. It was no longer familiar to him. In the dream maze formed by many minds, the huge white rabbit that walked upright squeezed through the open door and entered the vast wilderness with the grayish-white pillars and magnificent palaces. Mr. Wrath. Although it wasn't wearing the persona mask, its unforgettable characteristics were enough for Audrey to recognize him at a glance. This was out of her expectations, but it wasn't too surprising. From her point of view, just Mr. Wrath alone likely wasn't enough to deal with an ancient mind dragon like Erihog. Even if Mr. Fool had warned her to be wary of Mr. Wrath. After all, the leader behind the psychology alchemists, the former king of angels, had already become a sequence zero true god. According to the knowledge shared by the Tarot Club, there shouldn't be any other author beyonders in the real world. This way, no matter how powerful Mr. Wrath was, as long as it was still part of the spectator pathway, it would at most be on the same level as Erihog. The only things that would differ were combat experience, psychological research, and self-cultivation. At this moment, as the giant white rabbit entered, the large grayish-white, scaled Erihog spread open his wings which covered his skin. The surrounding area was instantly covered in a shadow. With a leap, the white rabbit's legs suddenly became extremely huge, like a tiny hill. At the same time, the gloomy sky above him lit up. The ground beneath his feet cracked open, spewing out crimson lava. Immediately after, a blurry and distorted figure appeared behind it. This figure was dressed in a simple white robe. It was difficult to see his face clearly, and it was impossible to tell his age. One could only vaguely tell that he was a man. A bright halo hung at the back of his head like a miniature sun. Beneath his feet was an illusory clock that was divided into 12 segments. Each segment represented a different symbol of time. Behind him, there was a shadow that looked like a curtain. Eyes seemed to be looking out from the shadow. Just after this figure appeared, the entire dream maze shook violently, and gray fragments fell from the void. The contrast of depravity and pure sunlight rapidly spread around the huge white rabbit, eroding or assimilating the area. However, that simple white-robed figure had trouble truly taking shape. He was unable to enter reality from history and illusions. Every time his silhouette became clear, his figure would distort like a machine that had its signal disrupted. At that moment, Audrey instinctively retracted her gaze, not daring to look directly at the huge white rabbit. Perhaps it was because she was in a dream and was closely connected to the mind island and the sea of collective subconscious. She didn't need anyone to explain to her because she knew what Mr. Wrath was doing. The other party knew the latent psychological problems of Arihog and knew what he feared the most. Then, according to this, it produced a nightmare that contained the specific images. In a battle between high-sequence beyonders of the spectator pathway, if both parties were at the same level, it would be difficult to produce any true effects using the various means available to them. One could sneak into the island of consciousness and attempt deep hypnosis. The other could guard the door to the body of heart and mind, preventing any foreign consciousness from entering. The other could spread a mental plague and use the sea of collective subconscious to intrude on the enemy without them realizing it. The other would be able to placate themselves, treat the psychological ailments, and maintain their mental health. Therefore, the battle between same-sequence spectator saints often had 3 fixed styles. First, set up a trap ahead of time as a multi-pronged attack preparation. Then, by secretly leading on and guiding the opponent, one could break down their mental defenses in one strike and complete the hypnosis. Second, one focused on their physical defense and as support, relying on powerful sealed artifacts to defeat their enemy. Third, when the Beyonder powers such as mental plague, mind deprivation, dragon's breath, consciousness control, and other Beyonder powers were unable to deal with their opponent, engaging in self-hypnotism and using dragon transformation would result in an intense melee battle that exchanged claw swipes and tail lashes. In the third battle, whoever had a deeper understanding of the mind domain, and whose will was stronger and firmer, would be able to gain the upper hand by relying on the extended usage of dragon transformation. Of course, the prerequisite was that the other party had no chance of escaping. And at the level of an angel, everyone was a true mythical creature. The maintenance time of dragon transformation became meaningless. At this moment, it mainly depended on observation. Whoever could find a flaw in the opponent's mind could weave a corresponding nightmare, directly attacking the enemy's weaknesses, slowly destroying their mental defenses and reaching the effect of going mad or dying out of fear. As Audrey was in the same dream, even if the nightmare wasn't directed at her, she was still affected by the corresponding emotions, characteristics, status, and even corruption. Now, she clearly knew that the nightmare that Mr. Wrath had weaved represented the ancient sun god. This was the most terrifying existence in Arihog's mind. At the same time, the ancient sun god's influence would uncontrollably corrupt the surroundings until it reached the entire dream. When the time came, once Audrey woke up, she would either become an untreatable mentally ill patient, or she would become an incomplete mythical creature, completely losing all reason and ending up wildly attacking the surrounding creatures. Of course, there was another possibility that she unknowingly became depraved. She would become cold, cruel, and bloodthirsty without realizing it, as if someone had replaced her. At this moment, Arihog, who was squatting at the top of the grayish-white pillar, let out a painful howl. As the dragon's roar echoed, the top of his head turned dark, revealing a sea of secrets and colors that was difficult to describe with words. In the sea, an even bigger grayish-white dragon spanning 1,000 meters long rose up. One of his vertical pupils was pale gold and the other was bright red color. There was a third eye on the dragon's forehead. It seemed to be hiding a thick shadow. Similarly, there was no need for anyone to explain. With the uniqueness of her present state, Audrey immediately knew what nightmare Arihog had weaved. This was something that left a deep trauma in the giant white rabbit's heart. This was the Ankwelt that had been corrupted by the underground world. This was the virtual persona and mental corruption which was sealed behind the bronze door, things that had been split off from that ancient god. At that moment, Audrey was in an indescribable nightmare. Although she hadn't been corrupted, her mental state was in turmoil, as though she had been awed. She immediately used placate on herself, and didn't hesitate to rely on her own consciousness to forcefully escape the dream maze. During this process, she didn't encounter any obstruction, not just because she wasn't Arihog's and Mr. Wrath's target, but also because she had reached sequence 4 and possessed a certain amount of godhood. Therefore, she quickly woke up from her dream. Audrey suddenly opened her eyes and saw a crystal chandelier dyed in faint crimson. She saw the deep darkness of the room. Without any delay, she got out of bed and ran to the window to look outside. The entire manor was completely silent, as if it was deep asleep. Everything was normal. Audrey frowned and immediately split out a virtual person, allowing it to enter the mind island of a night patroller. She remembered very clearly that the dream maze was formed by many minds. Once the two nightmares spread, the result was unimaginable. Therefore, before this, she had to wake up everyone in the manor. In the next second, the patrolling guard suddenly raised his hand and removed the grenade hanging from his belt. He pulled out the pin and threw it towards an empty garden. Boom! The loud explosion jolted awake the sleeping people. Immediately after, the guard shouted loudly, "Enemy assault! Enemy assault!" Earl Hall and his wife were already over 50 years old, so as light sleepers, they jolted awake immediately. Regardless of how good Hibbert's sleep quality was, he woke up in a reverie thanks to such a loud explosion. Alfred had opened his eyes the moment the grenade was thrown. The remaining butler, maids, footmen, and bodyguards woke up one after another. They looked confused and dumbfounded, not knowing what had happened. And at the far end of the manor's main building, a few servants heard the commotion and didn't wake up in time. A few seconds later, they struggled on the bed in pain. Like a snake shedding its skin, they broke free from their skin, turning into hideous bodies of blood. They didn't wake up until they died. At that moment, Audrey saw a grayish-white dragon spread its wings in the sea of collective subconscious as it rapidly departed. A huge white rabbit followed closely behind. In the blink of an eye, the dragon's voice resounded in the illusory sea. Adam isn't necessarily Adam, just like how I might not necessarily be Arihog. The giant white rabbit suddenly slowed down and gradually stopped. All the abnormalities came to an end as the entire area returned to normal. In the ancient palace above the fog, Adam didn't attack? The fool Klein frowned slightly as he turned his attention back to Utopia and replaced the instinctual monitoring of the worms of spirit. He carefully inspected his marionette town and didn't find anything abnormal. Chapter 1344 Humanity. Seeing that there weren't any abnormalities in the town of marionettes, Klein began thinking about Miss Justice's encounter. It wasn't Adam who set up an attack against Arihog, but Hermes who masterminded it? Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible for Adam to not descend. It would also be impossible for Arihog to escape so easily. He had to rely on the second city of miracles to have some hope of doing so. If Hermes was the mastermind, the development of this whole episode becomes logical. Hermes never thought of capturing or killing Arihog. He only hopes to learn some information from this ancient mind dragon. When Arihog said, "Adam isn't necessarily Adam," the operation came to a natural end. Yes, from the looks of it, Hermes already had some doubts about Adam's true state. However, due to the limitations of his status, he has been unable to make Arihog appear on his own accord, so he used Miss Justice. Adam isn't necessarily Adam. Arihog isn't necessarily Arihog. This sentence is very interesting. The upper echelons of the spectator pathway are more mysterious than seers. Back then, Dragon of Imagination Ankwelt clearly occupied Sequence 0, but he had a Sequence 1 son of the same pathway as him, Dragon of Nightmare, Alzahad. If Adam really isn't Adam, then who is he? Is it that Adam from the myth in the time before the first epoch, or part of the primordial one? Or is he related to the resurrection of the ancient sun god? From the looks of it, the meaning behind why Medici addresses him as a zealot has a far more profound meaning. Klein quickly conjured a gold coin and flicked it into the air, making a divination. The results of the divination indicated that today's development was nothing dangerous. Klein immediately dispersed the gold coin and prepared to descend his consciousness into his body beneath St. Ariana Cathedral. At this moment, his actions became slightly sluggish. The moment Miss Justice met Arihog and Hermes was almost simultaneous as the moment the MI9 personnel returned to Utopia to testify in court. Just looking at them individually, there was no problem. but the word simultaneous made Klein somewhat alert. He was very sensitive to words like happen to, coincidence, simultaneous, and almost the same. This was a mark left behind by his past experiences. He tapped his finger on the edge of the long mottled table and decided to make preparations for his worries. He quickly condensed a light that contained certain words and some kind of will, and he threw it into a prayer light. After doing this, Klein made his consciousness sink and left Sapphira Castle, allowing his mind to return to his original body. Immediately after, he began to influence Utopia. He planned to use all sorts of arrangements to temporarily make all the foreigners leave. This way, even if anything happened, it wouldn't affect the innocent. In the next second, Roselle Gustav's historical projection forged a piece of information that was completely normal, allowing it to follow the spirit body threads connected to the paper figurine to the St. Ariana Cathedral in the municipal square, moving straight underground to the cathedral. After this series of actions, another torrent of information surged in midair. With Roselle's help, they reformed into 3 figures. A middle-aged man wearing a black robe and a hood with a long, thick white beard. Another who was draped in a cloak, had black hair, blue eyes, and a rather squarish face. He was a middle-aged man with a dignified bearing. On one of the trees, there was a huge tree that seemed to be drenched with petroleum. On the tree, there were arms with all sorts of strange protruding objects that rolled with bloodshot eyes. They were the leader of the secret order Zeratul, Lone's protector, the first king, William Augustus I's historical projection. A historical projection of Abomination Sua. After making the necessary preparations, Zeratul used the location provided by the historical projection to sneak into Utopia. He didn't waste any time. He reached out with his right hand and used the law of convergence of beyonder characteristics to suck out the worm of spirit in Biles. Elsewhere, the palm of Abomination Sua's historical projection made an ugly doll the size of a palm appear. The doll was wet and sticky. It had no eyes, ears or nose. It only had a pinhole-like mouth that emitted and sucked grayish-white fog. As the worm of spirit and the doll approached, the black and white eyeballs that rolled out on the Sua tree trunk looked at them at the same time. Silently, the worm of spirit fused with the ugly doll, causing it to distort as it squirmed, growing out eyes, nose and ears, making it look like Klein Moretti. At this point, Zeratul no longer did any concealment, nor could he do so. He took out a black shroud and abruptly wrapped Klein's doll up. All the marionette spirit body threads in Utopia were severed at the same time. They were unable to connect to the true body. This wasn't because there was something wrong with them, but that the true body was isolated from them. All of a sudden, the duty personnel in the police station, tenants in the hotel, Tracy and the thieves in the cell, Anderson in another apartment, Alzu, and the other citizens all stopped breathing and turned stiff. Regardless of whether they were sleeping or doing something else, it was as if a pause button had been pressed. Klein, who was at the bottom of St. Ariana Cathedral, suddenly woke up. He knew that an accident had happened. He didn't hesitate. With a thought, he returned to Sapphira Castle. With the level and strength of a king of angels, he was able to resist enemies that had shown or had yet to show themselves. This was the best choice in the current situation. Even if he wasn't able to protect his true body, Klein still had a chance to revive. At that moment, his floating consciousness touched an invisible, dark barrier, making it difficult to penetrate it and enter Sapphira Castle. Klein's heart tightened, believing that the enemy might be more troublesome than he had imagined. Few high-level existences knew he could return to Sapphira Castle with a thought. In the next second, the thick petroleum-slathered tree had arrived above St. Ariana Cathedral. In addition, a deep and dignified voice resounded. "Wandering is prohibited here. Teleportation is prohibited here." Klein wasn't led by his emotions. Seeing that he couldn't return to Sapphira Castle at the moment, he immediately changed his strategy and leaped towards the fog of history. The moment the grayish-white fog entered his eyes, it turned into a whirlpool formed by countless transparent maggots. The vortex extended out slippery tentacles covered with strange patterns. Unlike previously, the vortex emitted a powerful suction force, causing Klein's figure to speed up and be entangled by countless tentacles. Law of Beyonder Characteristics Convergence. The law of Beyonder Characteristic Convergence between angels. A subtle beam of light flashed as Klein, who was firmly controlled by Zeratul's mythical creature form, turned into a paper figurine. This was an angel-level application of paper figurine substitutes, as well as the help of grafting. Although Klein couldn't return to Sapphira Castle, he could influence the worms of spirit above the grey fog, allowing them to use the curtain to provide help. After dodging Zeradal's fatal blow, Klein ran into the fog of history and fled towards the former metropolis from a time before the first epoch. At this moment, many marionettes, who had been dead for a long time in Utopia, rapidly decayed from losing the spirit body threads maintaining them. Their limbs dropped to the ground or mutated because of their beyonder characteristics. The latter transformed into different monsters, ones far more terrifying than imaginable. Some swallowed their heads. Others were left with only squirming flesh, while others grew dense eyes. Soon, Klein ran into the old metropolis situated inside the fog of history. To him, this was a safe room that could be trusted. This was because only a scholar of yore who was a human from before history could enter. Without any hesitation, Klein habitually surveyed the area and began praying to the Evernight goddess in the stacked city. Oof! A faint sound rang out as an ancient wooden stake with traces of blood penetrated Klein's heart from behind. A figure phased into existence behind him. It was a cold-looking man wearing a half-top hat and a black trench coat. Gehrman Sparrow. Klein's pupils dilated as the crazy adventurer said in a deep voice, "Adam has given me humanity." Chapter 1345. Meeting again. Klein turned around and looked at the familiar yet unfamiliar figure. He had imagined all kinds of attacks on Utopia, but he had never expected such a scene to occur. If Amon had parasitized the marionette, Gehrman Sparrow, then with Klein's current status and the spirit worms on Sapphira Castle, he definitely would have immediately discovered the problem. And if Zeratul were to swap the spirit body threads, he could only temporarily hide it from him. Furthermore, he needed help from an angel like a knowledge emperor or a servant of concealment to ensure the element of surprise in the sudden attack. Only the humanity provided by a spectator could slowly ferment, without revealing any abnormalities on the surface. To prevent such a situation, he could only sever the spirit body threads and allow the marionette to deteriorate till it died. That way, regardless of whether it had any humanity in it or not, it would ultimately cease to exist. Unfortunately, Klein had never heard of such methods before. All he did was guard against the invasion of a virtual persona on his marionettes. This might be the power of a visionary, giving life to everything virtual and immaterial, a unique sense of humanity. The carved and cold face was reflected in Klein's eyes as he felt a force pushing him away. He immediately fell backward, falling from the layers of ruins of the old metropolis out from the fog of history. During this process, he wanted to control himself, but there was nothing he could do. This was because the wooden stake at his heart had sealed all his beyonder powers. With a thought, Klein looked at Gehrman Sparrow and snapped his fingers. Pah! The worms of spirit in Sapphira Castle received his will and gave up the marionette's spirit body threads. They also picked up the Staff of the Stars and prepared to give Klein a fatal blow so as to commit suicide. After his main body completely died, Klein would be able to revive above the grey fog and escape from his predicament. He no longer held any hope after finding out that Adam was the mastermind behind the scenes. At this moment, a stone square floating in the void appeared beneath Klein's feet. Black stone pillars rose up and propped up a grand and holy cathedral, enveloping Klein inside. The Corpse Cathedral. Adam's Corpse Cathedral. The divine kingdom of a visionary. Boom! Countless bolts of silver lightning smote down from Sapphira Castle, penetrating the fog of history and struck the cathedral, but failed to shake it at all. At the same time, in the ancient palace, the figure sitting in the fool's seat suddenly collapsed to the side, forming a vortex formed from transparent maggots. The vortex extended out slippery and strange tentacles, crazily smacking the surroundings, overturning the junk pile, and destroying the long mottled table. Klein's avatar had lost contact with his true body, and because his true body hadn't really died, they had lost control and went crazy, just like Zeratul from before. In the old metropolis before the first epoch, Gehrman Sparrow, who was wearing a half-top hat and a black trench coat, looked up at Sapphira Castle, his expression mixed. He was basically a corpse. After his spirit body threads were abandoned, he naturally couldn't maintain his existence. The only thing Adam gave him was humanity. There was no envisioned life for him, as that would result in the discovery of there being something wrong with Gehrman Sparrow. Gehrman Sparrow slowly collapsed as he looked at the rooms in the old metropolis. He died in this ruin. Klein's feet landed on the ground and stood in the middle of the cathedral. He saw that every arch of each pillar was embedded with the skulls of different races. Most of them were pale white in color as they were packed densely together, staring at the intruder with their hollow eyes. On the walls, windows, and doors of the cathedral, transparent, distorted, and painful faces appeared, separating the interior from the outside world. And in front of the cathedral stood a cross that was more than 100 meters tall. In front of the cross were rows of black pews. Adam, who was wearing a simple white robe and had a pale gold beard, was standing under the cross with a silver cross hanging from his neck. He faced the pews like a priest who was preparing to deliver a sermon. His expression was warm and his eyes were limpid, as though he was only inviting Klein to listen to the scriptures. Klein lowered his head and looked at the cross-shaped wooden stake that was stuck in his chest. He slowly walked to the first pew and sat in the middle. For a true mythical creature formed from many worms of spirit, the wound on its chest wasn't fatal. The main purpose of the ancient bloody cross stake was to seal his beyonder powers. If not for the true god standing in front of him, Klein could have used his physical strength to pull out the wooden stake and remove the seal. At this moment, he didn't make any attempts because he was afraid that he would turn the thought of not daring to not willing to. I didn't expect you to directly interfere in this matter. If you wanted to deal with me, you didn't have to wait until today. Klein looked at his blood-stained shirt and seriously voiced his doubts. He wasn't afraid at all, as if he was certain that Adam wouldn't kill him. Adam held the silver cross pendant with one hand and calmly said, "Before now, you were able to be of quite some use in many ways." He took 2 steps forward and continued with limpid eyes. "When Amon came to steal the corpse cathedral, I made a deal with him. By helping me obtain the first blasphemy slate, I'll help him capture you." "Is that so?" Klein was instantly enlightened. On the one hand, Adam didn't wish to be obstructed by existences like the true creator when he became a god, and on the other hand, he wanted to obtain the first blasphemy slate. Therefore, he used the unshadowed crucifix and other methods to give Klein an impetus to head for the giant king's court, open the door to the chamber where Sasra was sleeping, and attract the attention of the true creator and other existences. On the other hand, he used his brother, Amon, to steal the first blasphemy slate at the critical moment. And to capture Klein, who was about to obtain preliminary control of Sapphira Castle, it would definitely be most appropriate to have a visionary arrange the developments for him. Although Amon and Adam usually appear distant, they are still brothers and can work together more easily. Klein nodded slightly and looked at the stained glass that had distorted faces. "I also didn't expect Zeratul to cooperate with you." "Isn't he afraid of becoming food for Amon?" When Klein established Utopia, he had considered Amon's attack and Zeratul's destruction. However, he never expected that they would work together in a certain way. From his point of view, the chances of Zeratul completely siding with the Mother Tree of Desire were higher than this, unless Adam had unknowingly arranged such a development for him. Adam's limpid eyes showed sympathy. To him, you becoming a great old one means that he will definitely perish. However, if Amon becomes one, as long as he expresses his loyalty, he can still retain his present level and status. A Lord of the Mysteries still requires an attendant of mysteries. Therefore, he chose to cooperate with me. During this process, if I can seize the opportunity and turn you into a marionette before I do, using you to enter Sapphira Castle and become the owner of the Sapphira, then he has the right to demand an opportunity to face Antigonus at Everknight's place and have an ultimate showdown with Amon. On the contrary, he will completely admit defeat and pledge allegiance to Amon. On this point, he was very decisive. "It doesn't seem like your style to explain so much," Klein replied casually before frowning. "You don't need all the sequence 1 beyonder characteristics of the corresponding pathway to become a great old one?" He had deduced this from the relationship between the ancient sun god and the 8 kings of angels. However, he believed that one had to first become a great old one or a quasi-one before dividing the characteristics. Adam replied gently, "For neighboring pathways, all that's needed is a uniqueness and a sequence 1 beyonder characteristic. It's easy to lose control if one forcefully occupies more. Therefore, after Zeratul pledged allegiance to Amon, he still has the chance to become a king of angels. And he isn't able to pledge allegiance to you because he can't separate a sequence 2 avatar like those from the Marauder pathway, and then stealing his main body, spirit body, consciousness, and psyche over, turning the avatar into the main body. This was the qualitative difference between a seer's marionette and a marauder's worm of time. The former involved spirit body threads, while the latter relied on themselves. Furthermore, the reason the Marauder Angel could do this was because their sequence 2 was Trojan Horse of Destiny. Just as Klein nodded, he suddenly saw Adam turn his body, revealing something beneath the cross. It was a gray stone slab. There were many mottled marks on its surface, making it look rather ancient. This was very similar to the first blasphemy slate, but it didn't have that abnormally ancient feeling to it. It also had words that looked like the source of all languages. They were written with the names of sequences and potion formulas. The second blasphemy slate? Klein asked in surprise. His gaze quickly swept across the stone slab. He didn't read the first few paragraphs, but instead looked at the last few lines. His intuition told him that there was a very important piece of information there. There's no need to rush. Amon has to complete the ritual and become a sequence 0 before stealing your fate. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to withstand the identity as Sapphira Castle's owner. And before that, it's best to let you continue staying in my kingdom. Adam acted as though he was consoling a repentant. Kill me, Klein muttered inwardly. At this moment, he figured out the last few lines. God Almighty, Creator, Maker, the Omnipotent and Omniscient, Lord of the Astral World. Sea of Chaos plus Visionary Uniqueness plus the Sun Uniqueness plus Tyrant Uniqueness plus White Tower Uniqueness plus the Hangman Uniqueness plus 1 Author Beyonder Characteristic plus 1 White Angel Beyonder Characteristic plus 1 Thunder God Beyonder Characteristic plus 1 Omniscient Eye Beyonder Characteristic plus 1 Dark Angel Beyonder Characteristic. Lord of the Mysteries, King of Space-Time, Beacon of Destiny, Embodiment of Sapphira Castle, Dominator of the Spirit World. Sapphira Castle plus the Fool Uniqueness plus Error Uniqueness plus Door Uniqueness plus 1 Attendant of Mysteries Beyonder Characteristic plus 1 Worm of Time Beyonder Characteristic plus 1 Key of Stars Beyonder Characteristic. Upon seeing this, Klein turned his head to look at Adam and asked in puzzlement, "Why are you showing me these? Wouldn't it be safer to hypnotize me and put me to sleep until Amon becomes a god?" Adam's eyes were clear as he said with a warm expression, "To be frank, if the other party wasn't Amon, then I'd be more willing to help you become the dominator of the spirit world. We have too many things in common. In a sense, we are old friends who have met before." With that said, he smiled and said, "We meet again, mysteries." Chapter 1346 The Specialness of a Visionary Mysteries. The last time Klein heard this title was from the consciousness of the true creator that had descended. The penultimate instance was from the ancient sun god from history, the City of Silver's creator. In a sense, the two of them were equal. The true creator was equivalent to the ancient sun god Evil Spirit, after retrieving Sasra's personality. However, unlike before, Klein wasn't flustered when he heard this manner of addressing him. Neither his heart trembled nor his teeth chattered. At this moment, he felt as if he had finally seen a suspended rock fall to the ground. Of course, he wasn't that calm either. To a certain extent, surprise, shock, and disbelief were inevitable. It was because of the words, "Adam isn't necessarily Adam," from Arihog that he had already come up with many speculations and was mentally prepared. We meet again. Mysteries. Adam is equivalent to the ancient sun god? Or is this the resurrection contingency of the ancient sun god? He knows of this, but he still wishes to revive his father, so that's why Medici calls him a zealot? Thoughts flashed through Klein's mind as he gained a brand new understanding of certain matters. It was no wonder Adam never promoted teachings about himself. He only spread what was left of the ancient sun god. Klein originally believed that this was due to the special trait of a visionary, and how he could use his uniqueness to create a bunch of realistic believers as anchors. This way, he didn't need to build a congregation, but from the looks of it, this was probably only one of the reasons. After 2 seconds of silence, he looked into Adam's pure eyes and said, "You are the ancient sun god?" Adam maintained his warm smile and said in an illuminating tone, "Don't you think I'm the most unique among the 8 kings of angels? After reading the contents of the second blasphemy slate regarding the great old ones, you should be able to clearly understand this point." Indeed. Klein nodded, indicating that he could tell. Of the 5 kings of angels related to omnipotence and omniscience, you are the only one with a uniqueness. According to the mysticism knowledge that Klein currently possessed, when the City of Silver's creator was still alive, the 8 kings of angels were in the same state. Dark Angel Sasra digested 2 sequence 1 characteristics of the Hanged Man pathway and controlled the first blasphemy slate, allowing him to use a portion of the power of the Chaos Sea. Therefore, he was heaven's deputy, the left hand of God, a king among kings of angels. White angel Occuses contained two sequence 1 characteristics of the sun pathway. Wind angel Leodoro, angel of wisdom Haraburgen, angel of fate Ouroboros also possessed two sequence 1 beyonder characteristics of their respective pathways. Angel of time Amon, red angel Medici were the ones with a uniqueness of their own pathway and a corresponding sequence 1 beyonder characteristic. Angel of imagination Adam had the spectator pathway's uniqueness and two sequence 1 beyonder characteristics. This didn't seem problematic at first glance, but it appeared strange on careful thought. Angel of time Amon and red angel Medici didn't belong to the 5 pathways of omnipotence and omniscience, and there was no problem about the ancient sun god using different methods to give them their uniqueness. However, Adam was different. Visionary belonged to one of the 5 pathways of omnipotence and omniscience, and the corresponding uniqueness was one of the foundations needed by the ancient sun god to become a great old one. In other words, this was equivalent to one of the 3 sequence 1 beyonder characteristics needed of a sequence 0. How could it be randomly separated? After all, Sasrar, as the deputy of heaven, the left hand of God, didn't obtain the uniqueness of the hanged man pathway, much less wind angel Leodoro, angel of wisdom Haraburgen, and white angel Occuses. Klein originally believed that the ancient sun god had sensed the awakening of the primordial one, so he had deliberately used the method of having children to separate one of the 5 uniquenesses from himself, taking the initiative to lower his level to resist the corruption and invasion. This was probably the thoughts of other deities and kings of angels back then. When he heard Arihog say, Adam isn't necessarily Adam, Klein felt that there might be a deeper secret hidden in this matter and came up with some guesses. After witnessing the last few lines of the second blasphemy slate, he found it even stranger. This was because a uniqueness was one of the foundations of becoming a great old one. If the Sapphira was the foundation, then the corresponding uniquenesses were weight-bearing columns. It would be deeply problematic no matter which one was lost. If the ancient sun god wanted to lower his level, the better choice would be to separate the sequence 1 beyonder characteristics. That would be relatively safer. Dressed in a simple white robe and wearing a thick golden beard, Adam walked to Klein's side and turned around. He looked at the blasphemy slate and said, "A visionary has something very special. Normal sequence 0s are made up of the uniqueness and 3 sequence 1 beyonder characteristics. Missing any one of them prevents them from being considered a true deity. They can only be considered a king of angels. And after becoming a sequence 0, a visionary is able to split 2 sequence 1 beyonder characteristics and replace the corresponding characteristic via envisioning. The object produced by envisioning is real enough. It can work perfectly under the framework of the uniqueness and a sequence 1 beyonder characteristic, allowing a visionary's level and strength to not decrease. The 2 real separated sequence 1 beyonder characteristics can be combined with one's other identity or a certain life form that's envisioned. It can make them become an author with complete freedom. When necessary, one can use a certain method or some mediums to transform him into the true form. And for the omnipotent and omniscient, he can create a uniqueness that borders between reality and illusory to maintain his state, as long as it doesn't exceed the necessary limitations. This is the relationship between Dragon of Imagination Ankwelt and his child, Dragon of Nightmare Alzahad? I once thought that the seer and marauder pathways were the most bizarre. From the looks of it, they can't compare to a spectator. Sigh, be careful of the spectator. Klein completely resolved the question on his mind. He also understood why Dragon of Imagination Ankwelt had arranged for 0-08 to meet Grozel's travels. Once they met, 0-08's quill, which originated from the Dragon of Nightmare Alzahad, would awaken and become the Dragon of Imagination Ankwelt at a lower level. Then, this resurrected ancient god would use the negative persona sealed behind the bronze door to activate the Chaos Sea's power, instantly reaching the level of the strongest king of angels below that of true deities. With such a foundation, he had the chance to compete with Adam for the position of visionary and completely revive. It's simpler, neater, and cleaner compared to the Black Emperor's resurrection. Klein nodded slightly and said, "The relationship between Dragon of Imagination and the Dragon of Nightmare?" Adam sat down beside Klein. Yes. However, the Dragon of Imagination had been corrupted, and he had characteristics of other pathways, putting him in a poor condition. All he could do was separate an author. Otherwise, He would have directly lost control. Klein ignored Adam beside him and looked at the second blasphemy slate in front of him. What's the difference between this and a marauder's avatar? If a mon can become an error, he too can create at least 2 sequence 1 avatars. Adam leaned forward and simply explained, the avatar and the main body are still the same, but they are located in different areas. Does that mean that the sequence 1 that's envisioned is completely separated from the real body and can be considered another person? Only by using some method or using some medium can one awaken. Klein asked thoughtfully. You awakened when you became a visionary? No. Adam looked straight ahead and replied with a gentle expression. When I perished and True was born. Klein asked in surprise. Was no one suspicious? If the deities knew that the ancient sun god had long been resurrected in Adam, the history of the fourth epoch would most likely be to besiege the Solomon Empire, the Twilight Hermit Order, and the Amon family. Apart from True knowing about this, perhaps only Evernight had her suspicions, Adam said. His voice neither fast nor slow. I disguised myself as a zealot wanting my father to awaken in my body. It's not difficult for a king of angels from the visionary pathway to do so. Then Medici? Klein suddenly felt pity for the Red Angel. Thinking up to this point, he lowered his head to look at the blood-stained wooden stake on his chest. He felt that he deserved more sympathy. Adam said calmly. It was a necessary sacrifice. Why do you think he can remain alive for so many years after becoming an evil spirit without being discovered? Klein fell silent for 2 seconds before asking, Are you going to let me wait just like this? You can also choose to leave this corpse cathedral, but Zeratul will be waiting for you at the entrance. In your present state, you can only become his marionette, Adam said without any emotion. Klein fell silent as he read the remaining contents of the second blasphemy slate. In the fog sea, the dawn silently sailed through the undulating blue waves. Bernadette suddenly opened her eyes and sat up. She frowned and picked up an item on the table. The item was completely golden in color, and there were mysterious symbols engraved on its surface, making it look like a miniature water flask. This was sealed artifact 0-05. Magic wishing lamp. Bernadette held the wishing lamp and bowed her head as she chanted an honorific name. The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.